Hello once again and welcome to Chats with Atheists. And we welcome once again today Peter Bowditch, well-known Australian humanist and a member of the skeptic movement. And today a question that's probably a little bit more serious than some of the others that we've been talking about. We're going to be looking at the problem of evil. Is it possible for a good God to create a world in which there is evil, as the world in which we live is? The charges sometimes laid against Christianity that the presence of evil in the world means that there could not be a good God. Either God is not really good and therefore he allows evil, or God is not all-powerful and he can't stop evil. But the presence of evil seems not to fit with the idea that God exists. So to help us go through this interesting and rather difficult topic, we're going to have a chat with Peter. Peter, how strongly do you see the objection of the problem of evil as working against Christian faith?
I think it's the most significant argument.
Yeah.
It appears to be the only issue in the whole discussion of religion, theology, and everything else, which has its own name, and it's theodicy.
Yes.
It's a quite specific discipline, which is the discussion of this existence of evil problem. I don't know whether there is an answer to it, because a lot of people are smarter than me have been discussing this for maybe the last 2,000 years.
Yes.
I think, though, we need to look at evil in different ways. The problem of people behaving badly is a separate issue to evil things happening to people naturally or accidentally.
Things like earthquakes and
and
tsunamis and so on. Yes.
The fact that people can behave badly really just reflects the concept of free will. And that's what Genesis 2 is about, if you like.
Yes.
That people can make choices. They can be bad choices, good choices. And there are consequences of bad choices. We hope there are consequences of bad choices. And obviously rewards and consequences for good choices. So I think we can put that one aside. The argument really is about why do bad things happen to good people for no apparent reason.
Sure. Well, look, before we move on to that one, let's just delve a little bit more deeply into the first one. And that's sometimes called the logical problem of evil, if we can put a framework that helps us to discuss it. So that's the argument that God could have made human beings in such a way that they didn't commit those atrocities and those evils. But as you've identified, there's actually a philosopher called Alvin Plantinga, who I'm sure you've come across, who apparently has more or less, as you said, solved that problem after 2,000 years of discussion. And the discussion goes all the way back to the ancient Christian fathers, Irenaeus and Augustine and so on, all discuss this. And his solution is exactly what you've just said, the free will, that a world with beings who have free will is better, more good than a world in which there is no free will. But of course, free will has to have its consequences, otherwise it's not really free. So if I couldn't do evil, even if I chose to, then I'm not really free. That's sort of more or less, you agree with that?
I do,
with
yes,
that argument?
that's correct. Yeah. I think that if you have no opportunity to do bad things,
yes,
then you have no opportunity to sin, and you therefore have no opportunity for redemption or atonement.
Yeah.
So I think that you really have to be able to do bad things.
Yes.
Otherwise, let's distinguish it from good things, I suppose.
Yeah.
There doesn't seem to be much point to a religion which doesn't allow people to do bad things. Certainly something like Christianity, where people actually have, when the aim is that there was, if you're a Christian, you believe that Jesus made a sacrifice on your behalf to atone for your sins. If you can't sin, what was the point of that? Jesus was doing something for nothing.
Yeah.
So I can actually see that point.
Sure.
Whether God should put a restriction on how evil people can be is another question altogether.
Yeah.
And again, I think that goes back to the whether God is actually omnipotent or so forth. But it's reasonable to argue that God should be able to allow people to do little bad things, but maybe not allow people to do really, really bad things.
Well, it could be argued that that already is the case. I mean, prior to the nuclear age, really the ability of human beings to do bad things and harm other people or harm the environment or the world was really quite limited.
It was.
It's only really in the modern age that we've developed the ability to kill all life on earth.
I mean, people point to the Inquisition as being one of the dreadful things that Christianity did, and how all these people were burnt at the stake. We're talking about people in the tens of thousands, and that's all.
Yeah, yes, that's quite.
I mean, now you can kill people. You can kill several million people in one day. I mean, like something like 400,000 people, 300,000 people died in Hiroshima.
Yeah.
In one incident. We now have the technology to be able to destroy huge numbers of people all at once.
Yeah.
Whereas, yes, modern technology has given us the ability to be much more evil than we could before.
It has, and those who have access to it, though, is also a very small proportion of people.
Yeah.
And we hope a responsible group of
That's
people.
right. And the number of people who can actually launch a nuclear attack on another city
Yes.
is very, very small.
So by and large, for the general population, there's not really that much.
So I think that those sort of extreme evil things, yes, it is restricted anyway.
Yes.
But I mean, that doesn't stop people. We see through it in the paper, people are torturing people and torturing animals and so forth.
Yeah.
These things tend to be beyond what normal human beings want to do.
Yeah.
We see those people as being mentally ill anyway, or different to the rest of us.
That's true. Okay, if we look at the logical problem of evil, and hopefully we've dispensed with that, the second idea is the emotional problem of evil, which I suppose can be defined as that reaction that we have when we see, for example, a child who's been abused, physically and sexually and so on, and the child is innocent, and we think, well, that's just totally unjust and totally unfair. That's not really a logical reaction so much as it is an emotional reaction. What do you think about that problem of evil?
I think that still fits into that category, that it's a human being acting badly.
Yes.
I think that really we need to move beyond that into what happened. An infant dies in a fire in a house.
Yeah.
How does God allow that to happen? That sort of thing. It's not a human action. It's not a person behaving badly.
Sure.
It's a natural thing. How does, for example, with the tsunami that went across Aceh, Indonesia, a few years back, where 250,000 people died.
Yes.
Now, they were all sorts of religious people. There were a large majority of them, the local population were, of course, Muslim. But there were Christians, atheists, all sorts of people. The other side of the Indian Ocean, there were Hindus and Muslims that were affected by that. They weren't all bad people, so you can't say, well, God was just getting rid of very bad people.
No, although there are groups who jump to that conclusion.
I know.
And sadly, I have to say, within the general wider Christian community, there are people who saw that as the judgment of God on people. But as you say, I don't think that God works that way. I certainly, as a Christian, would see that not being the case. And
I think they're the ones where it's hard to actually argue. And they're the ones that, when the arguments are made, and they said that if God couldn't stop it, he isn't omnipotent.
Yes.
If he didn't know about it, he's not omniscient. And if he's not either of those things, he's not really God and doesn't care.
Yes.
A lot of that, the justification for that, seems to be people trying to bang square pegs into round holes. That they'll come up with things saying, oh, well, it was an example to other people, or it was... we're not talking about Sodom and Gomorrah here. We're talking about people just going about their normal lives.
Not really that different to anyone else in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It just happened to be. It's easier to point and say, oh, gee, it all happened because there are a whole bunch of Muslims there. And that particularly was the high point in Indonesia of the move to create an Islamist society in Indonesia. And so God said, I don't like you lot, I'll wipe you all out. Not the sort of God I want to believe in.
Well, no, and then you'd also have to ask, I mean, why didn't that happen to Iran or, someplace else where there's a huge, Muslim movement?
Yeah. Or other places. I mean, there are lots of places in the world where there are worse things happening.
That's right. Yeah.
Than people, going on holidays in Indonesia.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether this is a problem that can be answered, because you really do come into that paradox situation that if you're going to believe in an omnipotent, omniscient God who's good, can you allow that good God to do bad things for no reason?
Yeah.
Can you say, well, things were happening outside God's control? Things happening outside God's control, then you can hardly claim that your God can do everything as an omnipotent and knows everything.
Yeah, well, obviously the Orthodox Christian does try to answer that,
Yeah.
so allow me to put my understanding of what the response is, and I'd love to hear your views on it.
Yeah.
So by my understanding, God creates the whole world as a good thing, in which originally the nature of it is not such that there are things like, well, I mean, there may have been earthquakes and tsunamis as natural phenomenon, but they don't wipe people out, and there's a harmony between humanity and nature, a harmony between the animals and nature and the forces of nature and so on. And because humanity is the pinnacle of the creation, in a sense all of the creation is linked to humanity. When the free will choice is made by humanity to sin, corruption comes into the nature not only of humans, which leads to those actions that are evil, but it also enters into the very nature of the world, and the harmony is broken between humanity and nature. And that's why things go wrong.
Yeah.
And therefore we would say that natural evil is a consequence of human evil, which interestingly, that idea of the link between humanity and the world is kind of starting to come up again in secular philosophical areas sometimes. What do you think about that? I have another bit to add at the end, but I'll get your thoughts on that first.
It seems to be the concept of original sin, that after the fall, everybody was bad in some sense. I mean, it's the reason for the story of Noah's flood.
Yeah.
That's all very bad, let's start again. I'm not quite sure it's a convincing argument, though, although I don't know whether I can actually point to where it isn't convincing. It seems to me to be an easy way out, to say, well, because there is some kind of evil in the world, some kind of sin, people behaving badly, that people who are innocent have to suffer because of that. It's a strange kind of justification, I think.
Yeah, the other part to it, just to complete the argument, I think, and this is something I've sort of only recently really come to realise, is that although there is evil in the world, I think one could make a very strong case that the amount of good in the world is actually an awful lot more than the amount of evil. We certainly see, horrendous things that happen like the tsunami and think, okay, that's pretty bad. But if you sort of look at the life of the average human being on the earth, they spent 70 or 80 years on average. They have a lot of good things happening. They enjoy their family, they enjoy their friends, they enjoy food and drink. And, most of our life that we spend on the earth is actually full of a lot of really good things. So could it be argued that, in a sense, God has actually, even though our free will choice has corrupted the world from the Orthodox point of view, God has still limited that? I don't know if you'd agree that there is a lot more good in the world than there is evil.
Oh, I think there certainly is. Again, I'm not quite sure whether it's a convincing argument, although I can see why you might think so. It doesn't seem to be a balance out thing. It still doesn't explain why really bad things can happen to people who, for no apparent reason.
Yeah.
Look at the example of a child dying in fire. God could do a tiny little miracle which no one would notice to prevent that from happening.
Yeah.
If say it's an electrical fire, God could actually prevent that happening.
Sure.
It's all very well to say, oh, well, we need some bad things to create, if you like, a moral outrage. So people will become, decide to actually act. People will set up charities to handle people who are in poverty and destroyed.
Yeah. I'm not a fan of that argument, to be honest with you.
It's not a good argument, I don't think, because it seems to me that you've made an argument for a deceptive God. A God who says, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something really, really bad, and that will make people think about how they should behave, and that will make them then go out and behave better.
Yeah.
Not because it's an example of what happens to bad people. That is, you do bad things, this will happen to you. It's, I'll do this random bad thing, and that will cause people to behave well and respond.
Yeah. I would argue against that argument, using an argument actually from the 5th century. St. John Chrysostom actually wrote a homily or whatever, a letter, called that God is not the cause of evils. In a sense, God doesn't need to intervene to make something evil happen. There's enough evil happening as a natural consequence of the laws of nature and that corruption that I was speaking about before, without God actually needing to come in and do it. And in fact, I think we would say the God that we understand, if you want to use a human term, he weeps over every evil that happened. There is no case of evil that occurs in the world in which God takes pleasure or rejoices. No. In fact, if he is a good God, he rather puts up with the evil rather than ever causes it or even wants it to happen. He may be able to take an evil and bring something good out of it in the end, but it would always have been better if the evil had never happened, and that's kind of the will of God. Which brings up the power of God. Well, if that's the will of God and he doesn't want evil to happen, then why is evil happening? To which we come back to the free will and the idea that humanity and nature are tied together, and the free will choice of humanity has led to the whole of the world.
I thought we come back to the problem of saying, well, there are some things which are so dreadful that God should have stopped them happening. If someone had assassinated Hitler in 1927, we might not have had the Holocaust and the Second World War. That could have happened as a miracle without anybody noticing it as being a miracle. God could have prevented the Holocaust. To allow it to happen suggests that we don't know, but we shouldn't know the mind of God anyway. I don't know what we learnt from that. I don't know what good things could have possibly come out of killing of 7 or 8, 10 million people just because of their ethnicity or their sexual preference or their mental illness. There are things which God could have prevented by a miracle without anybody knowing it was a miracle.
Well, this is the third of our issues here, which is sometimes called the probabilistic problem of evil. So we've had the logical one and the emotional one. This is the one that says, okay, we might accept that free will could lead to some evil in the world, but why is there as much as there is? Why is there such drastic evil as there is? And couldn't God have limited that amount? Now, if you'll allow me to put my understanding of it, and I'd love to hear your response once again, it's very difficult to judge something like that, because we could imagine a possible world in which there was, say, 1 million times as much evil as we have in our world. Now, the inhabitants of that world would look at our world and say, if we had that little evil, then we would understand and we would accept God as love and his limited evil. So isn't it just a relative kind of thing for us to try and say, how much evil is too much? Where would you draw the line? What would you say would be a sufficient amount of evil that God is still good?
That's a difficult question. I can imagine where there was too much. I mean, I can't imagine being a tutu in Rwanda a few years back and believing there was a just God out there that was looking after me. It didn't matter which side you were on that case, everyone was killing everyone. There was just so much going on. But in that society, those people would have looked out and thought, anything must be better than this.
It's horrible, but the point I'm making is in this other possible world, you might have had tutus who didn't just suffer that for a year, but suffered it forever. And they would say, if we only had to suffer it for a year, that would be paradise.
I still don't think it gets back to addressing the issue of why certain extremely evil things happen. There are some things which you can understand that God might allow to happen just because it's a way that he can't interfere with everything. But there are particular occasions where you look at it and say that should never have happened. And we learn nothing from that. All we've got is a disaster. All we've got is pain, dreadful consequences, terrible things happening. And I think they're the ones where people outside can point and say, well, if God was omnipotent, God could have stopped that and should have stopped that if God is good. There are, we know that, understand that he can allow certain bad things to happen. But there are some things which are just so evil that maybe they should never have been allowed to happen.
So if we take an extreme case at the other end of the world, we can imagine another possible world in which nothing evil ever happens except, let's say, at some stage, one little girl pricks her finger on a thorn and it hurts and she says, ouch. If we lived in that world, would the same objections apply?
That's the stereotypical vision of heaven that people have.
But there's a little tiny bit of evil there. Would we say, but God should have stopped that?
So I think that there are, it depends on the consequences of it.
Yeah.
Someone pricking their finger on a rose thorn, yes, it hurts a little bit.
Yeah.
That's not quite the same as pricking the finger on a rose thorn and got tetanus and died in immense pain,
Yeah.
tied up in little knots because all their muscles decided to contract at the same time. So there are different levels. There are obviously degrees of things of badness.
Yeah.
Where we draw the line on what is the worst thing, I think, is the problem.
Is the question,
Is the
exactly. And I think in that idealistic paradisal sort of world, maybe people would be so outraged at this, that evil has entered into our paradise, that maybe they would feel just as, irate and upset that God would allow it. Which basically is really the argument that I'm trying to make, is to come back and say, well, it all depends on, what you're willing to accept and what you're not willing to accept, which is an arbitrary kind of
It is an
decision.
arbitrary. But going back to this concept of heaven that people have, which is interesting, by the way, heaven always seems to be based on what today's experience is, what would be a perfect life today.
Yes.
So, if you asked people 50 years ago what heaven was, it wouldn't have had iPads in it. But today it'd be unlimited downloads and everything else. In that perfect society, yes, if your harpstring broke, it would be a major disaster and you want to know why.
Yeah.
Which is why those sort of models don't ever have those things in them. Everything is perfection. Nothing ever goes wrong. No one stubs their toe. No one hurts themselves.
Yeah.
Those sort of things aren't ever going to happen. So yes, I think we have to have degrees. We say that there are degrees of badness. There is a general consensus on some of these things. That is, it is okay. There's an argument going at the moment about whether it should be legislated that you can't slap a child.
Yes, that's an interesting one.
This is actually a quite interesting argument. To be quite honest, I have two daughters. I've only ever hit either of them once each. One of them bit me, and it required an immediate response to stop that happening.
Yeah.
And the other one started screaming in the car for no reason whatsoever. And so I turned around and slapped her on the leg, and it stopped. It never happened again. But she'd started this, we'd be driving along and she would suddenly start letting out this enormous scream, which was dangerous, it was distracting to the driver.
Of course, yeah.
If someone said you can't do anything like that, and I'm not quite sure, I don't believe that you should be able to hit kids. But sometimes that's an appropriate reaction because it can be done without permanent harm, but it gets their attention and stops whatever behaviour you've got at the moment.
Yeah.
To actually legislate and say you should never have any kind of corporal punishment on a child is a dangerous place to go, because there are degrees of, slap a kid. Well, the ads on the TV about the chippy slap that are going on now, it's fun that you reach out for the crisps and someone goes, stop that.
Yes. Well, that's actually,
but no one says you should be able to pick up your child and hurl them against the wall.
No, of course.
So there are degrees in all sorts of things like this. We have to decide what's good and there is a general consensus on this that you shouldn't hit children. Yeah. But there will be times when you might do it for a particular reason. But there are also limits to where you should go with that as well.
And again, that's a consensus that we share because of the nature of our current society and civilization. And obviously other societies at different times and different places would have a very different idea of what's right or wrong. But that's actually, I'd like to use your analogy as an analogy of how God deals with the world. I think that the child, may not understand why they're being slapped, or they may feel unjustly treated or be upset that it happened. But you kind of have to rely on the wisdom of the parent and the father. And perhaps when we deal with evil in the world, as I said, as we believe that God himself weeps over the evil that happens, it's not like you wanted to slap your child or took pleasure in slapping your child, but maybe there are times when that's a necessary thing. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up. We always want to keep going in these chats. I'm sorry, Peter, but time is our enemy here. Thank you very much once again for joining us.
Thank you.
And for sharing your wisdom and insights with us. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you.
And thank you to all our audience who've been watching and I hope have been stimulated into thinking about things a little bit more deeply. We look forward to seeing you on another occasion. Goodbye.